Hey everybody, this is Ray with budgetshooting.com. Today I just wanted to do a video going over how I Moly Resin coat Form 1 suppressor tube. Moly Resin is a phenolic coating, has a lot of similar properties to Cerakote. It's one of three big players in firearms coating. I know there's Cerakote, Moly Resin, and Duracoat is what a lot of people use if they're not using spray paint or something like that. I like the resilience of Moly Resin. It seems to hold up a little bit better than my Cerakoted stuff. The other nice thing about it, especially for Form 1 tubes, is it doesn't add a whole lot of thickness like Cerakote, but it has a lubricity to it, so it makes threads feel really nice. Of course, there's some threads that you don't want it on because you don't want that interference with the thread engagement, but it's such a thin coating most of the time you can't really tell. When I'm coating a Form 1 tube, I try and keep it off of the ASR threads. The end cap threads are usually fine. They always seem a little bit sloppier when I get them from vendors and stuff like that, so I usually don't worry too much about them, and I actually try and get a little bit of the threads coated, just a little bit of stick out, especially with these rimless caps because they have a range of adjustment. And I don't want there to be any silver streaks or anything like that if I have to adjust it out or further in or anything like that. But yeah, I really like Moly Resin. It's a lot easier to DIY at home. It's a little bit more forgiving than Cerakote coatings. Prep work is about the same if you want a good finish, but I like it because it's a little bit easier to spray at home than my experience with Cerakote. It holds up really well. They offer a wide range of colors. Not quite as many as Cerakote, but a lot of the more popular gun colors they're going to have available on their website, which is molyresin.com. That's where I always order through. I'm not actually sure if it's available anywhere else, but I order from them. You get free shipping if you order over a certain amount. Usually I order 2 of the smaller bottles and it gets me to the free shipping, and it is a little bit cheaper to get into than Cerakote. You don't have to worry about mixing any hardeners or anything like that. It all comes in the tube. You just have to make sure that you shake it up really good before you pour it into your gun to apply. Speaking of guns, paint guns at least, I just use one of these Harbor Freight detail spray guns. They're super cheap. I added a regulator and a filter on it just because you want to be able to dial in the spray when you're doing this kind of stuff. It's not too hard to set up. I just followed a couple of YouTube tutorials on how to set up a spray gun in general, and it got me close enough with this thing to let me dial it in when I was actually spraying a part. Other than that, you don't need a whole lot. Sandblasting is recommended. So I bought a little blast cabinet. You can get away with sanding. I haven't had the best experience. It seems like depending on the finish that you're putting it on, if you don't blast it, it has the tendency to chip off if you go too thin. So I had that issue with an anodized tube for an aluminum 22 can that I built. It's held up fine on the titanium can that I did, just sanding the outside, but blast gives you a better finish overall. That's why I decided to invest in the blast cabinet. And then over here, we've got my toaster oven that I picked up from Goodwill for 10 bucks, and I just leave it in the shop for doing stuff like this. You don't need anything really big for small gun parts. I was able to fit the barreled receiver for my 300 Blackout in there, short action Remington 700 receiver and 9-inch barrel all barely fit in there, but they fit. So it's handled all of the suppressor tubes that I've wanted to do just fine. It would handle most AR handguard lengths under like 14 inches. Uppers and lowers, as long as they're stripped, would be fine. Really, the toaster oven is fine for most uses. If you want to start getting into longer stuff, you start running into some of the specialty oven building and stuff like that that other Cerakoters have to deal with. But as far as DIYing, the toaster oven for most small parts has gotten me exactly where I needed it to be. So in addition to the stuff I mentioned, I just used some mechanics wire to get things tied up to the grate that goes in the toaster oven. The blasting media, I just use the recommended aluminum oxide, 100 grit specifically. I think most coatings recommend 100 to 120 grit, so I grabbed 100 grit. I just got it off of Amazon. It doesn't have to be anything special, just make sure it's aluminum oxide, 100 to 120 grit. And then the only other thing you need is acetone, because when you degas your parts, before you degas your parts, you want to try and get all the oils and stuff off, and acetone works great for that. You can also use brake parts cleaner from a auto parts store, anything like that. You just want to make sure you can get the oils and fingerprints and all that kind of stuff off. And then you're also going to want rubber gloves, so that way you don't want to touch it and leave your hand oils and stuff like that all over the tube when you go to coat it, because that could show up in the final product. So the tube I'm coating today is my little 5-inch can. I've actually previously sandblasted it and OxyClean boiled it to darken the titanium. This is just raw blasted and darkened titanium, but I did mess up the coating a little bit when I was originally doing it, and that's what those streaks are from. I used a stainless steel pot. On the burner, when it was contacting, it left those streaks, and I just haven't liked the look of it since I completed it. So I got some new colors of Moly Resin, a tan and a gray, so I'm going to spray this with the tan so I can give it a try and see how it does compared to the burnt bronze that I've sprayed before. That's the only color I have experience with. But yeah, I'll take you through the process today of what I do to coat these tubes, and we'll see how it turns out. This is admittedly probably going to be harder to see and hear since I'm wearing a respirator, but the first step is to blast everything. So I'm just going to go through that real quick in my little blast cabinet. It's just a tabletop unit, but it gets the job done. Yeah, let's get that done. When I'm blasting these, I do try and stay away from the threads just because I don't want to damage the threads. So I run the cap all the way in, and I either mask off or just make sure to stay away from the ASR threaded portion. Can use the glove in this case to kind of cover that up while I'm blasting. This tube has already been blasted before, like I said, but I just want to clean up the surface finish, especially because of those marks and everything that were on there. Hopefully get everything covered up. So after the blasting, I just like to pull it out and double check. Make sure I hit everything, which it looks like we did on this one. Since it was already done before, it didn't really need much just to clean up, but I always like to just double check, make sure I hit everything, but this one looks like we're good to go. Alrighty, now I just find a little container that'll fit the tube, good enough to wash it in some acetone, which I've got here. So we'll get that poured in and get this thing cleaned up of all the oils and residue and things like that. Plus side to a container like this is it's got the little spout on the end, so I can save the acetone when I'm done with it, put it back in the container, use it for another coating. Ideally, you should be wearing gloves for this, so let me grab some. Alright, now that we got some gloves, I usually just slosh this thing around, get it inside and out, let it soak in there a bit. At this point, you can also run the threads back out a little bit, assuming we can get that. There we go. Get some of that gunk that ends up in the threads also. I just want to make sure everything is cleaned off, so let's get those cleaned up separate from each other. Get all that dust out of the threads. Should be looking pretty good in there now. It's even getting some of that carbon off from having shot it already. Not all of it, but most of it. As soon as those are cleaned off, as long as you're wearing gloves, you can pull it out Get that depth set to wherever you want it. I like to coat about that much of the threads. Just give it one more little dunk. And after that, you just let that dry off and you're good to go for this step. Now that we're done with the acetone and getting everything all cleaned up, I just like to get it fixtured up. This is the grate that came with my toaster oven, and so I use it as a work holding implement just to hold everything. This is where I spray it over here because it lets me clamp to the table and get a good spray on it, but I just use my mechanics wire and get it all tied up on there so it's in the position that I want. So I just get that set up to about the height that I want it at. Trim off the excess, that way it doesn't cause any problems in the oven. And there we have it. Now I'll just take it over to the toaster oven as soon as it's preheated, and we'll degas it, get all the oils out, make sure it's ready to go for coating, and then I'll show you guys the process of coating it as soon as I'm done. So one more thing while I wait for that thing to degas before I spray it. Moly Resin does recommend preheating the parts. That way when you spray them, your atomized paint will dry on contact, and it helps with the sheen because most of their colors are flat. It helps maintain that satin or flat look, and it also gives you a little bit cleaner coating because they recommend multiple thin coats, so I will preheat between coats to get it to that preheated temperature that they recommend. And it really does help you because it will dry on the surface as you're spraying it, and then you also know where you've already sprayed for some of these colors that are a little bit more difficult to see on whatever color you're spraying. So I find that helps for me to preheat the part, not only to degas, but so that that paint dries on contact. Just want to throw that in there. It's a little tip that they throw in, and I wanted to make sure you guys knew that too. The other thing I like to do while I let that degas is shake up the Moly Resin. They recommend it before you spray it because there's multiple different pigments and hardeners and things in the bottle that will settle out, especially if you don't use it for a while. So you just shake it for a few minutes, make sure everything gets incorporated before you spray it. You can have issues with hardening or color rendition if you fail to do this, so just make sure you give it a good shake for a few minutes while you're waiting for your parts to degas in the toaster oven. Alrighty, we've got this degassed, so I'm going to go ahead and get it hung up here and start spraying. So when you degas, you do want to make sure that all the oils and everything are gone and you have a flat surface that's ready to spray. In this case, we're good to go, so I'm going to go ahead and start spraying. So I'll usually get 1 or 2 coats done while it's still warm, and then I'll throw it back in the oven and let it heat up again. That way the next coats that we spray dry on contact again. So it really just needs a couple of minutes back in the oven to reheat. Since there's pigment and stuff in the gun, you do want to make sure to give it a little shake before you spray again. So we're at about 6 coats. I like to do 7 or 8 usually, so I'm going to let it heat one more time. We'll do another couple coats. And the other thing with Moly resin to note is it does seem like the more coats you put on, the more the color comes out. So you can kind of judge how thick your coating is and how it's going to look in the end when you start seeing the actual color that you wanted sprayed pop out even after letting it preheat in the oven. As soon as you add another coat, if it's looking like the color you want, I would do a couple more coats and then let it do its cure. So I'm going to do another preheat, another couple coats, and then I'll tell you guys the process of letting it harden in the oven after you're done with all of that. All right, 2 more coats and we're on to curing. All right, let's get that back. Let's get that back in the oven, and then I'll tell you the process of curing it. Okay, so it's back in the oven. Moly Resin recommends 300 degrees at 1 hour. So I do have a little temperature unit back there. You do want to verify the temperature of your toaster oven before you do it. That way you know where to set the dial and where 300 degrees is. But after you do all that, you just throw it in there after you're done with the coats. Turn your oven to wherever 300 degrees will net you. Verify on your gauge that it gets there, and then you just close it up. I set the timer for an hour. That's the highest that this goes. I will check it occasionally until I see the temperature get to 300, and then I'll set it back to an hour, and I will just let it sit for that time while it's in there. I might spot check it a few times. While it's in there baking, just to make sure that the temperature stays where I want it. But this toaster oven is pretty good about that, so I don't have to check it too much. I do occasionally check to make sure it's not changing color or anything like that. Some of the Moly resin colors are real specific about temperature, and if you go too high, they can start to darken or change to a different brown. I don't think that's an issue with this one, but we'll see. It's my first time spraying it and letting it cure, so we'll find out. But yeah, most Moly resins, you want to check the material that comes with it to verify the temperature and time, but most Moly resins are 300 degrees for 1 hour. So just keep that in mind. Always double check, but that's how most of them are. So I'm gonna let this one bake, and I'll show you guys the final product as soon as it's done. All right, I just wanted to throw a couple notes in while I wait for that thing to bake. In case you couldn't hear me when I was kneeling down doing the painting because of the respirator, I do like to do somewhere between 6 and 8 coats. Usually you can tell as you start building up the coats how the color is actually going to look, because it does take at least 5 or 6 to really start seeing that color. And I like to do 6 to 8, sometimes a couple more if I need to, depending on how the color is coming out, just to make sure I get a thick enough coating that it's actually going to protect and be useful and not super thin and scratch off with your thumbnail or something like that. The other things I was going to throw in is you can do this with a lot less equipment. I know people are using the Preval canned air sprayers to do this, which works with just sandpaper to rough up the texture and use that. Moly Resin also recommends a cheap $20 Harbor Freight airbrush, especially for small surfaces like this. It really just lets you get in there real quick with the gun and on a cheaper scale than what I've got here. The one thing you do need is some kind of oven. You can use the one in the house. It does give off a little bit of a smell as it's baking, so that's why I went the dedicated oven route. I picked that thing up at a thrift store for like 10 bucks. Like I said, it works perfect leaving it in the garage for this and any other projects that I need to heat anything up. It works pretty good. I would at least recommend that. I jumped straight into it with the spray gun because I knew I was going to be doing more than just one coating here and there. I know people have had a lot of luck with the airbrush kits, so that's definitely a viable option. You don't need to have the compressor, the air gun, the blast cabinet, anything like that to get this done. You can do it with the more basic of equipment, which is one reason it's super DIY friendly compared to Cerakote. One other thing that I wanted to mention was that when you're putting the material in the gun, err on the side of too much as opposed to not enough. It's way easier to clean out the gun of any unused material and have that little bit of waste cost compared to scrambling, trying to reshake up, make sure everything's incorporated, refill the gun. Not that there's any kind of time crunch because it is a heat cure material, but I feel like when I'm doing it, I feel that need to get everything done quickly before it goes into its bake time. I don't know why. I think that's just from other paint projects that I've done where paint cure time is time-based and not necessarily heat-based. So I just like to make sure I have too much and everything's ready to go before I do it, as opposed to not having enough and doing that mid-spray scramble trying to get everything set back up. But it's up to you and how you want to do it. Probably not as big of a deal with an airbrush, depending on container size and stuff like that. But with my gun and everything that I've got going on, I just like to make sure I err on the side of a little bit too much material. Alrighty then, let's get a look at that final product now that it just beeped the oven. See there, it's coming down from the 300 degrees that it was. Finish looks pretty good to me. As soon as it cools off, I'll have to get it inspected and built back up with the mount and baffles, and we'll see how it looks out of the oven. Alright, so got it all reassembled and back together, and so this is basically what we have as our finished product. Nice smooth tan color, got my Kurz mount on there, nice contrast. Nice finish overall. It's way better than the boiled OxyClean finish that I had on it. Had a bunch of streaks all over it from where it touched the bottom of the pan when I was doing it. But real happy with all of the different Moly Resin colors that I've used. They're easy to apply, they're more forgiving than Cerakote. It always gives me a nice finish. Real happy with the product. I would suggest you give it a try if you want something that's a little bit easier to apply at home but has the same durability and a lot of the same aspects of Cerakote. They have a fairly wide range of colors and it's getting bigger the more time goes on, it seems like. I don't think it's ever going to be quite as expansive as Cerakote, but it's decent, especially for gun stuff. You don't have as many wild colors or anything like that, but for what a lot of people would want, it's going to cover all those bases. So yeah, thank you for watching. If you've got any questions about the process or anything you saw in the video, go ahead and put it in the comments below. I'll try and answer to the best of my ability. I'm not a professional coder or an expert or anything like that. It's just something I picked up doing for my own guns at my house because I was tired of paying people and sending everything out to have it coated, and this works well enough for my needs. But yeah, if you got any questions, comments, anything, put it down in the comment section below and I'll try and reply. I'll try to reply to everything. But yeah, thank you for watching.